And streaming failed. Okay, I think we are streaming. First time I ever went live, and I got a message streaming failed, and now apparently it's recovered. I'm Sarah Olivieri, and today I want to talk to you about the difference between biases and conflict of interests or conflicts of interest. Now, I work often with nonprofit CEOs, and in the nonprofit space, people are always worried about conflicts of interest. And whenever they hear money is involved, they go, conflict of interest, conflict of interest. But the truth is, usually when money's involved, it can be just as easily or more often a confluence of interest. So let's talk about, step back for a moment and talk about the difference between a conflict of interest and not a conflict of interest, and a conflict of interest and a bias. So a conflict of interest is basically when we're in some sort of situation where, let's say, we have a conflict of interest with the organization. So would I do the best for the organization, or is something going to cause me to have my alliance elsewhere? So I'll give you some examples of true conflicts of interest, and then I'll give you some examples of some commonly misidentified conflicts of interest. So if I am an executive director of an animal rescue nonprofit, and you ask me to be on your board of another animal rescue nonprofit or any other nonprofit, I probably have a conflict of interest, because I'm going to put my efforts and energy towards securing donors and media recognition to my nonprofit that I am a paid employee of, that my livelihood and my heart is dependent on, before I'm going to consider the interests of your organization that you've asked me to be on the board of. That's a conflict of interest. Now let's imagine I'm on your board. And we often talk about this in the role of boards, but it's not always boards. It could be any area of your organization, but we'll use this example. If I am on your board and I am, like I actually am, a nonprofit consultant, and you hire me to do a service for your organization, that is not a conflict of interest. That is actually a confluence of interest. So, but with a caveat. So I was already incentivized to help the nonprofit as a board member. And now by paying me to do a job to help the nonprofit, I am doubly or triply incentivized to help the nonprofit. The area where I do have a conflict of interest and a bias is in setting my own payment or agreeing to my own contract terms. I should not be checking my own contract or verifying that I've given the nonprofit a good deal. Now, I am likely to give the nonprofit a better deal than another consultant who is not on the board because of the confluence of interest, if you're following me. But it is still worth checking, right? Did I in fact provide a fair market rate, or even what's more common and more likely, a below market rate? You wouldn't want, though, to underpay me from my normal rate too much, because then I will have a conflict of interest. I'll be more inclined to serve my normal paying clients than I would you as my underpaying client. So this is something to be mindful of. And if you're ever in this position, a good consultant or a good service provider will tell you, this is how much I can give you at a discount or for free, or I can't give you anything at a discount or for free, because it would create this conflict of interest for me that would not serve your best interests. Let's talk about biases for a moment. So if you have a bias, it means that you are likely to think a certain way. And these could be learned biases. We often talk about unconscious biases, but an unconscious bias can become a conscious bias easily. I think the more important way to frame it is we have learned biases, and we have kind of inherent biases, just how our brain works. So a learned bias might be we have been taught to talk to children like they are very inferior and aren't capable of understanding certain things, which is sometimes true, but sometimes not true, right? Some people really baby children, and other people tend to treat children like more independently minded people, but we're taught to behave a certain way and make certain assumptions about children. We also have biases where just I wouldn't call them learned biases, but we're just uncomfortable, right? So we might be uncomfortable if we've never really hung out with someone in a wheelchair before. We might feel uncomfortable, and our discomfort will cause us to have a bias to act less inclusive. However, if we are aware of that bias, we don't have to act on it, right? And that's the thing that we have to be careful about. It's okay. Everybody has biases, and that's fine. The issue is whether or not you act on your bias in an unaware fashion. Now we have inherent biases as well. So there's something called an attribution bias, right? So we tend, when we think about others' actions, we tend to say it's because of some attribute they have, right? So like they didn't show up on time because they're lazy, or they're just always late, or they don't care, right? But if we didn't show up on time, it's usually because of something specific that happened, right? My alarm didn't go off. I was awake all night. I had to get my son on the bus, and the bus came late, and that made everything else late in my day. So that's just kind of how our brains often work. So it's just the difference between how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive others. So those are biases. So if you have a bias, it's important to become aware of it and then decide if you are capable of overriding that bias or not in a situation. If you're not capable of overriding that bias, then you may in fact have a conflict of interest. Or you just may have a bias that's going to cause you to behave in a way I'd call it a conflict of interest. If you have a bias that you can't modify your behavior on, then you may have a conflict of interest. That being said, in general, if you have a conflict of interest, you're probably going to be best off for everybody if you recuse yourself from making any decisions. But we all have biases, and we all have a variety of conflicts and confluences of interest. And the most important thing, I think, is that we put them out into the air and give other people an opportunity to help judge what kind of weight to put on our input, knowing that we have something that's going to tip the scales one way or another. And that is where a bias and a conflict of interest are similar. So just to sum it up, I'll say a bias is something we're likely to think. And a conflict of interest is a little heavier because it's like this self-reinforcing system, right? So I'm being pulled by money or something that's beyond just what's in my head. And so that's why conflicts of interest can be a little more impactful even than a bias. So, but mostly it's important to get these things out in the air and have honest, open conversations about them with our teams and the other people involved so that we can decide together. And the more we kind of have real, true, open, vulnerable types conversations, the more we can overcome our biases and our conflicts of interest and move forward in a positive direction. I'm Sarah Olivieri, and I bring you these tips every week out of my Thrive coaching call. My Thrivers are the amazing nonprofit CEOs who are part of my Thrive program. And if you would like to be in the room addressing your specific situations with me and a group of amazing peers, I strongly encourage you to apply at pivotground.com/application. Or if you just like free tips in your email box and notices of upcoming trainings and other things like that, you can go to pivotground.com